binding context to be the post property that comes from the view model. So the view model is going to set the binding context for the entire content page. But then we are setting the stacks layout binding context to one of the properties of the view model, in this case the post. So everything inside of the stack layout, instead of having the entire view model as the binding context, is only going to have the post as the binding context. So we can keep the entries text bound to experience and the selected item of the list view bound to venue, both in a two-way mode. But then the toolbar item will have to be bound to the post command. But the toolbar item still has a binding context of the view model entirely, because it is outside of the stack layout, but inside of the content page. So all we have to do is get rid of the clicked event handler that we have and set the command instead. And the command is going to be binding to the post command. We will also need to set the command parameter, which is going to be binding to the post, which is also a property from the view model. So in here we're going to have a binding context for the content page, and then we're setting a binding context only for the stack layout. But currently that binding context is actually one of the properties of the binding context for the content page. So this is how you would have two different binding contexts, but this is actually wrong. Because if we want to know when the post changes, we need to have properties that are going to be updating the post. The properties that we need are a string for the experience and a venue for the venue that is being bound to the selected item, and that are currently bound as properties of the post object that is inside of the VM. But we do need to change the VM a little bit. The first thing that we need to change is implement the iNotify property change. And with that implementation, we need to create a private void onPropertyChange method, which receives a string with the property name. In here, as always, we evaluate if the property change event has any subscribers, and if it does, we fire it. And we will need to change the post property to be a full property. And in the setter, we're going to be calling the onPropertyChange method. We're also going to need the properties for the other two bindings. The first one is going to be a string. It's going to be the experience. We have to call the onPropertyChange method. And the second one is going to be the venue. And we also call the onPropertyChange method from the setter. But just like we've been doing before, it is not enough by setting the experience to the experience variable. We also have to create a new post. So we're going to be setting the post property to a new post that is going to initialize its experience value to the experience in the local property and its venue to the venue of the local property. And because we are setting the property itself and not just the variable, the onPropertyChange for the post property of the view model is now going to be executed. I will also need to copy this and paste it on the venue. And back in the SAML file, we are not going to be changing the binding context of the stack layout. It is going to remain as experience and venue, but now these properties are coming directly from the view model. Because remember that the view model is the binding context for the entire page. And since we are now not changing the binding context for the stack layout, these now refer to the properties of the view model. And now every time these properties change, the post property will also change, and so the canExecute method can be evaluated one more time. So that's it. I am going to set a breakpoint inside of the view model in the publish post and in the post command in the execute. And I will run this on a simulator. I will first log in with one of the credentials that exist. I will navigate to the new travel page. I do have to set the location for the emulator. And notice that it doesn't seem to be inactive, the button for saving, but if we try to press it, nothing really happens because it is, even if it doesn't seem inactive. And if we write something, we got an exception, and I think it is because we are not initializing the venue property. So in the constructor for the view model, I am going to initialize the venue to a new venue, because currently it was null and it was trying to be assigned from the setter of the experience. And since we are assigning a new venue in the post class, when we set the venue, we are accessing some of the properties of the venue which may be null. So what we can evaluate is if first category is different than null first. And if it is, we can access it and set it to the category ID and the category name. And then do the same thing with the location. Evaluate if venue.location is different than null. And if it is, set the value to the corresponding properties. And the name is a string, so it won't be null. And the ID is also a string, so it won't be null either. And by the way, we're also getting the categories, which could also be null. So before getting the first category, we should evaluate if venue.categories is different than null. And in case it is, we will get the first category and then evaluate if it is different than null and assign the category ID and category name. Okay, so let's try this again on the simulator. So first I have to log in. I navigate to the new travel page. I set the location and I will write some experience. And notice that now if I press on the save button, I do get a breakpoint in the execute. And if we expand the values, we see that the experience is set. The rest of the values is not set because the venue is an empty venue. All of its properties are null. But this means that we have correctly set the parameter and we are correctly evaluating the execute. And if we continue, this is of course going to execute the published post as well. And if we click on continue, we are getting an exception. And this doesn't have to do anything with the command, it has to do with the mobile service. And it turns out that we added to the post class an object. We added a venue object. All of the other properties are strings or integers or doubles. These are not objects. These are just values. And if we try to insert an object into a table, we are going to get that error. But don't worry, we do not need to delete the entire property. We will have to change a lot. All we have to do is tell the serialization, when the serialization happens, to ignore this property. And it happens that the serialization happens with JSON. So we have to set an attribute similar to what we did previously with SQLite, and this one has to be JSON ignore. This one will require us to add the Newtonsoft.json using directive, and now this property is going to be ignored when serializing this object into JSON. Eventually a JSON is the one that is going to be sent to Azure. That JSON is not going to be containing the venue anymore because we are going to be ignoring it. So we can try this for the third time. I am going to sign in, navigate to the new travel page. I will set the location. This time I do want to select one element, set some experience, click on save. The breakpoint is hit and now the parameter should have the values, indeed from the venue that we have just selected. Click on continue, and this time we see that the alert has been displayed. So the functionality is identical to the one that we had before, changing the event handlers for commands. And we have now replaced every event handler for a command. So we have also learned how to use commands and how they are going to work very closely with the view model classes that we have created. In the next lecture, we're going to start to talk about another interface, the I-value converter interface.